first webinar, so you're going to have to bear with me. I'm standing in, as Simone said, I'm standing in for Elizabeth Pina. So what we're going to be looking at is developing a search strategy for systematic reviews. So the objectives for this session is to understand the need for a comprehensive search, to know what databases and the types of literature to search for, how to identify key concepts for the search and the search terms, understanding Boolean operators and mesh terms and how to use them, and understand how to build a search strategy, and finally to understand how to conduct a search in PubMed. So why is a search strategy important, and what is a search strategy? So a search strategy is a plan that will help you to find the information you need, and it will be a means by which you are able to systematically find the relevant materials on a specific topic. So, and developing a search strategy is very important, as this way you'll be able to replicate your search, verify your search, and report your search. And this is extremely important for systematic reviews. So, a systematic review requires a complete view of all the existing literature, and this can only be achieved by performing a comprehensive search of relevant databases. For Cochrane systematic reviews, it's expected that you search at least 2 electronic databases. Okay, and then just a choice of where you're going to search will be determined by the topic area. Perhaps I can ask a question now to find out when, if any of you have conducted any searches, where would you have searched? Could you just type it in the chat box? Good, so I've seen a number of you are using PubMed, which is a very good source to cover. And then I've seen 1 or 2 people have said Google Scholar. Just if you are conducting a systematic review, a Google Scholar would be a good place to search for. But just to remember, when you're searching Google Scholar, it only retrieves the first 10,000 records, and you're not sure whether it would be retrieving the relevant information. So that's just something to remember when you're doing your searching. So these are a number of electronic databases that we're giving examples of. So your general ones would be PubMed, Cochrane Library, Embase, Web of Science, and Scopus. And then you have your specialist databases. These are just examples of some of these databases. Is African Index Medicus, so that is focusing around African health. ERIC, which is an educational database. PsycInfo, which is psychology, psychiatry, and behavioral sciences. And then CINAHL, which is nursing and allied health. So it will very much depend on what you'd normally do is to search a general database, and then in addition search a specialist database. In addition to searching those electronic databases, it's good to search other sources, and these would include your grey literature, your reference list of included studies, and this will help you to identify additional studies, contacting experts in the field, those working in the field, and authors of included studies, people that have published on that specific topic, and then your research networks, examples of mailing lists. These are examples of grey literature, and just for those who may not know what grey literature is, it is the materials and research produced by organizations outside of the traditional commercial or academic publishing and distribution channels. So your websites and databases would be the WHO Library, Open Grey, which has a European focus. Then you have your trial registries, which is very important because this will highlight ongoing studies. So you have the Pan-African Clinical Trial Registry and the WHO International Clinical Trial Registry, and then you have your dissertations and thesis, and you'll see there that website is specifically for SA, South African thesis and dissertations. Then you have your government reports and research, and an example is the SADC website, and then your conference abstracts. So your Web of Science will give you some conference abstracts, but then also the societies and organizations such as the International AIDS Society. So before you can develop your search strategy, you actually need to know what your question is. That would be the first step. The next step would be, is one way that we do it when we're wanting to do our systematic review, is to ask the question. And the way that we formulate our question is using the PICO format, which has 4 essential components. And the first one is, your P is, who is the population or the patients? What is the intervention or the action? And is there a comparator for what you're comparing it to the intervention? And then what is the desired outcome? So that would be the very first step before you even think about your search strategy, would be having your question figured out. Then the next step is, once you've identified your PICO, you need to create your search terms from your PICO. And you'd normally start with the 2 or 3 most important search concepts. And you'd focus on those terms which you're most likely to find in the title or the abstract. And the reason for this is that when you're searching PubMed, for example, it doesn't search the whole article. It will only be searching in the title and the abstract. So that's very important to remember when you're developing your search. I'll probably pause for a moment and find out if there are any questions from anyone. None. No. Okay. So when this is an example that we're going to be using, is a case scenario. We had a member of parliament who was suffering from cancer, and he wanted to legalize cannabis for medicinal use. And we needed to now find information on cannabinoids for nausea and vomiting in adults with adults with cancer receiving chemotherapy. So what I'd like you to do now is see whether you can identify the various concepts for this. I'll give you a minute. So for your participants, I would need who your participants are. What is the intervention for the question above? If there's a comparison, and what is the outcome? So for the first one, we'll just ask you to tell me who are the participants. So you can type it in the chat box. Yes, we have adults. Yes, that's correct. Adults with cancer. Yes. Exactly. Great. So we're looking at adults with cancer receiving chemotherapy. Fantastic. So now we look at the intervention. Cannabinoids. That's correct. Cannabinoids. Chemotherapy is not in the intervention because we're looking at what out for nausea and vomiting. So chemotherapy is actually, the nausea and vomiting is the result of the chemotherapy. So we're looking at what is the intervention to prevent the vomiting. So cannabinoids is correct. And then is there a comparison? No. Yep. No. That's correct. We haven't indicated any comparison. And the outcome would be Nausea and vomiting, that's correct. So when we're talking about the outcome, it could be a decrease in the nausea and less vomiting. Okay, great. So that is what I've come up with for the PICO. So now once we've identified our PICO, the next step is to take each of those concepts, your participants, your interventions, and those would be the two most important concepts that you will use when you further develop your search strategy. You will have to take that, identify your search terms, express each of those concepts of the PICO in as many words as possible. You do this by using text words, and these would be the words used by authors in the title and the abstract. You need to include synonyms, alternative spelling, opposites, for example. You can use truncation to identify variations of words. For example, if you typed in protect with an asterisk, it's going to retrieve protect, protected, protection, and protective. But you need to be very careful when using truncation. Because, for example, if I typed in car with an asterisk, it's going to retrieve cars, carcinoma, cardiovascular. So all the types, it's not going to give me exactly what I'm wanting. And also when you're doing that in PubMed, it only gives you the first 800 variations of the word, and it might not retrieve what you are looking for. So be careful when you're using truncation. In addition to using search terms, you also need to include medical subject headings. So these are terms which are used to index the articles. So they basically like tags. And mesh terms is what is used in PubMed specifically. Each database will have their own subject headings. For instance, in Embase, they use what they call M3. And it would be different to the terms which is used in PubMed. So that's something that you need to be wary of when you're doing your searches, is to make sure that you're using the correct terms for the databases that you're accessing. Another thing to take note of, that the terms are assigned by indexes, which might not be perfect. And that's another reason why you need to search for your mesh terms as well as free text terms. Another thing to note is that for your mesh terms, you either need to explode it or focus on a specific heading. Mesh headings normally appear in a tree, and you'll see from the next example, you'll see at the top it has cannabinoids, and there's carotenoids, etc. So you need to decide, do I need to search for all of this, or do I only need to identify certain text or certain terms to be included in my search strategy? Okay. So now we've got our PICO. The next thing we need to do is to write down the text words, and we need to use our imagination when we're doing this. So think about the words that the authors would use within their in the articles that they're publishing. You need to make sure that, because everybody will use a different term. I might say cancer, others might say tumors, they might use totally different terms. They might use a different spelling. So what I'd like you to do now, for just the participants, if you could, in the chat, give me the terms, the text words that we would need to search for. So in the chat, I just need, under participants, adult malignancy, cancer patients. Okay. So I've got some of these terms. Somebody's saying cancer patients. So tumor patients, chemotherapy, cancer patients, chemo patients, malignancy. So all of these terms, we need to note that I'm not saying that they are incorrect, but you need to be careful when you're searching, because remember, if I'm just putting in cancer patients, somebody else might have said they're talking about adults with cancer. So if I search just cancer patients, it wouldn't necessarily find adults with cancer. So we need to be very careful how we actually structure our terms that we're going to be putting in PubMed when we do our search. For our interventions, I will show you what my search terms are that we're going to be using in the next slide. But for now, I'd like to ask you to give me the terms for our intervention. Dacha, cannabis, cannabinoids. Yes, that's all correct. Cannabis, weeds, cannabis. Yes. So I think those are all very good terms that we would use when we're doing our search. Okay, wonderful. So there you'll see what the terms that I've come up with for our search strategy. And you'll note that I haven't included adults, I haven't included patients. And the reason for that is we need to keep our search as broad as possible. So you don't want to exclude, you want to make sure that you don't exclude any papers. And by doing so, if you're just including specific words around cancer, that will ensure that we find all the papers possible. Okay. The same with cannabinoids. They are the different terms. And just remember, this is just an example to show you how to structure a search strategy. Any questions? Okay. So as I mentioned previously, you want to be broad in when you're conducting your search, but sometimes you might retrieve too many articles. And we wouldn't necessarily include outcome as part of your search strategy, because this is not always clearly defined. This is not clearly defined in your in the paper, in the abstract. But there might be terms that is very possible. So what you need to do, you have to weigh up first and see how many records you retrieve, and then whether to include outcomes, but only if you are sure that they will be included in the abstract or they mentioned somewhere. The other thing is that it might not be, it might only be a secondary outcome, and therefore it might not be included in the abstract. I had one question, is why I have not included chemotherapy. Yes, you are correct. Chemotherapy should be part of the search. I did not include it because I was trying to keep it very simple in terms of when we putting the search together, because when we're using Boolean operators, it will be a lot more complex. I was just trying to keep it a very simple search. But you are correct that chemotherapy would be part of the search strategy. Okay. So now that we've got our search terms, the next step is now how do we actually combine those terms? And we combine them by using Boolean operators. And the most commonly used ones are or, which we normally use to combine synonyms or words within one concept. And that would normally instruct the search tool to retrieve any records that contains either or both of the terms that we're looking for, and that will broaden your search. And the other Boolean operator is AND, which is normally used to combine your various concepts or to search for both terms must appear in your search results. And a good example is of this So I want to find out whether eating sweets and donuts makes us happy. So I would want that both sweets and donuts should appear in all of the articles. So I would use and. If I want to find out whether sweets or donuts makes me happy, I would use or. So the word sweets could appear either on its own, donuts on its own, or both donuts and sweets would appear in the articles. And a good way to remember which Boolean operator to use is the way I do it is or gives me more. So if I use or, I'm going to retrieve a lot more articles. So now we've got our Boolean operators. So we've got our first concept, and that is your patients. So you have cancer, or neoplasm, or tumors, or tumor. And you'll note that I'm using plural. I'm using alternative spelling just to give an example of how to structure your search. And for the person who asked about chemotherapy, what would have happened is that below all of this, I would have had to and chemotherapy because it would be patients with chemotherapy. But I was trying to keep it very simple, just to try and explain to you a very simple way to structure your search. We then and it with our interventions, which would be your cannabinoids, cannabis, or medical marijuana. Then when conducting your search, it's important that your search is as sensitive because we want to avoid missing any studies when we do our search. And we should ensure that where we search or how we search or where it was published, so whether it's published in German or whether it's published in English, because we don't speak German doesn't mean it needs to be excluded. We need to ensure that we include everything possible. The second one is you wouldn't limit by year, except in certain cases. For instance, if I was doing a study on HIV, and we know that the first papers were only published in the 1980s, so we'd only search from 1980 onwards. Okay. Then if we were only looking at studies on humans, we would search for humans and not animals. And then age groups, we could limit to age groups, but we also have to be very careful when we're limiting to age groups because different authors would identify this. For instance, if you were looking at adolescents, they might have different years. Some might say 17, some might say 18. So it's very dependent on what the author is looking at. So you have to be careful about limiting age groups. And then finally, study design. When we're doing Cochrane reviews, they mostly look at randomized control and include randomized controlled trials in the systematic reviews. So this is just a website where you could go and find different search filters, including if you were looking at a specific population. Elizabeth Pina has developed a search filter for African studies, and that is where you actually go and find a list of the various search filters. That's the example of a validated search filter which has been developed by Cochrane for when you're searching for randomized controlled trials. And you can go, there's a link to the handbook, the Cochrane handbook, for more information about searching. Yeah. Do not what? No. So the year you wouldn't limit your search unless you were looking at a specific time frame. So generally, when you're doing your search, you wouldn't limit it to any specific period. Okay. So you would then, once you do your search, you'll test and you'll refine that search because you need to find out, well, is it adequate what I'm doing? Is my search what I've developed, is it good enough? And one way to do it is to use key papers to test that search strategy. So we need to ask, is it picking up the papers that we're aware of that's out there? Have any papers been missed? We need to find out why. Do you need to adjust the search strategy? And a rough guide is, you'd know that you're on the right track if in the first 100 you're finding 10 potentially relevant papers, but that would also be dependent on your topic. So the one question is, what is the minimum number of articles can one use for a systematic review? And there isn't a minimum number. It depends if you're getting, what your search is retrieving, your included criteria. If it's 100, then so be it, it will be 100. It's really dependent, will be dependent on your topic. So there's no minimum to the number of articles. So the rough guide of 110 potentially relevant papers, what that I'm trying to say is, so when you do your search and you retrieve your results, out of the first 100 articles that has been retrieved, you should potentially find 10 papers that is relevant to your study. But once again, that will be dependent on your topic. Okay. So the next thing is very important, is to manage that search process. The search methods must be transparent, and you must be able to reproduce your search. That's very, very important. So if anybody comes back and says, how did you get to the search results? You need to be able to provide them with that information. You need to keep a record of the sources that you search, the date of your search, and the search strategies and the results. And you will find that when you're searching more than one database, for instance, if you were searching PubMed and Embase, there's normally an overlap of search results, and using management reference management software is a good way to manage that search results, so that you can deduplicate before you actually scan those abstracts. Any more questions? Okay. So this is an example of a search strategy which we've developed. And this would be specifically around a search for a Cochrane review that we've done. And perhaps I would like to ask you, we'll go back and work backwards, and can you perhaps tell me who the participants are for this search strategy? Hmm? Yeah. There was a question about using. Yes, no, it's infants. So our population participants would be infants. That's correct. And it's infants with, specifically, what group are we looking at? Just infants, but infants with what? Yes, that's correct. HIV and TB. So we're looking specifically at infants with HIV and TB. And the intervention is what? What would our intervention be? Correct. Chemoprophylaxis. Wonderful.
Chemoprophylaxis.
So the question that we had around this search strategy that I developed was, looking at chemoprophylaxis for preventing TB in HIV-infected children. So this would have been, this is the strategy that we've developed specifically for that question. I know if you look, and you're probably looking at all these tags, these field tag, what we call field tags, which says TIAB in brackets. And what that means is that I'm only wanting to search in the title and the abstract, but that's more advanced. When you're trying to reduce your search results, that's one way of doing it. And then there was a question about Zotero and Rehab. What's it, Rayan? I've not used Rayan. It also, I can't speak on that. I know that Zotero is a free-to-use reference management software, and I think it's very good. I've heard from people that it's quite good. So I can't speak on that, unfortunately.
So Rayan, Zotero is a reference management software, whereas Rayan is a software that helps you screening. So you can load all the records from the search strategy on Rayan, and it helps you keep track of who's screening what record and what to improve. So it helps you with
Thank you, Solange. So MH is medical subject heading. That is, so remember I told you this, we spoke about MESH, and that is what MH stands for. So there's a medical subject heading. So infant is one of those medical subject headings. This is an example of the search methods, which has been included in a Cochrane systematic review. And what you will see up front, we decide exactly where we're going to search. In the electronic databases, so examples would be Embase, Medline, and Central. Then we're also going to do other resources, which is your reference list. And then there's the other communication with authors of papers. And then your registries, your trial registries for ongoing trials, and then conference abstracts. So you'll see that there's a whole list of places that you need to search. So you need to make sure that you actually do an exhaustive search strategy. Then some key tips. Don't reinvent the wheel. Have a look to see if there are any good quality systematic reviews in your area. Check what sources of information they use. Check what databases they searched. See how the papers were indexed in those databases. And you can use and adapt those search strategies with acknowledgement. And then also to work with a librarian where possible when developing a search strategy. So now we've developed our search strategy. Yes. No, you have to download all of them. So beforehand, you need to decide what your inclusion criteria will be, and based on what your inclusion criteria will be, you will then look at that and each of your abstracts, base it on that and decide what needs to be included. So you have to look at all 900. But just a very quick note to say that you could easily, and I know, I mean, I've done searches where there have been thousands of records retrieved. You could easily get through up to 1,000 in a day of screening. So it does help. So the advantages of searching different databases, there was a question around that, is that not you have to make sure that firstly, if you're searching a general database, number one, and then if there's a specific area that you're looking at, for instance, if you're looking at maybe nursing, that they specialize in those topics. So PubMed might not include any of those journals, which would be included in SANOM. So that would be the reason why you'd have to search an additional database. In the same way, if you were searching PubMed, you'd also want to search Embase, because PubMed might not have all of what is included in Embase and vice versa. Okay. So now what we're going to do is, I'm actually going to do that search. I'm going to show you how to do that search in PubMed. So the first place I'm going to click on is to go into the advanced search. And the reason why we're going to be doing that is you'll see down the side, it has a search folder. So what I want to do is, and it's very good because this way you're using your PICO. So the first thing that we want to enter is our participants. So we're going to enter cancer or tumor or tumors. And you'll notice that I'm putting my Boolean operators in uppercase. And the reason that I do that is you have to be very, very careful when you're typing to make sure you're not making any mistakes in your search, because that can have an impact on the results of your search. So it's very, very important to make sure that you're typing the words correctly. And then the next one we'll be looking at is to search for is the intervention. So we're typing in cannabinoids or medical marijuana or cannabis. So you see how we're developing the search in the same way that we're using our PICO to come up with our search terms. We will use exactly the same way in which we're going to be doing the search. And that's why it's important to use the advanced search, because then you can break it down into each of those concepts. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to click on Add to History. Okay. Okay, and you'll see it's retrieved 1,920 records, which is not bad. Okay, I'm going to click on that 1,920. And now it's telling me what my best match is for that, for my search that I've included. Okay, so you'll see if we go down here, it lists all of the articles that could be relevant. So we need to go through it and see, are any of these relevant to what we are looking for? Okay. I haven't found anything yet. Doesn't look like there's anything. What we can do is we could go back to our search. Okay. And now I can put in, because maybe we want to look at vomiting. Maybe we're just adding vomiting or nausea. This is going to reduce our search. Okay. So those are the two terms I want to add. And this is going to make sure that actually my search is more refined. Okay. So now I actually I've got my first part of my search, but now I need to add that outcome as part of my search. So I'm going to search for number 1 and number 2, because I need to and it, because I'm wanting to search for all those articles, which includes all of those terms of each. So it could be cancer or tumor or tumors and the intervention and the outcome. And I add to history. And now you'll see from 1,920, it's come down to 323 records. So you'll see how you are able to refine your search. I'll click on that. There we can go down and see. There's one that might be relevant. There's another one. So as you can see, there's a way in which you can actually refine your search that it comes up more with the relevant material for what you're looking for. So you don't have to go through thousands, but it's also important to remember to rather keep your search broad and start from that point and then see depending on your results and then to refine your search further. And then just to mention, and this I haven't included as part of my presentation, but for instance, if you wanted to go through each of these records, you could export them, okay? So you could select all of you could either select some of these records by clicking on the side, and then you would say send to a file. And it's important to note here where it says the format, you need to include it in the Medline format, so that you'll be able to import it into reference management software. I click RevMan and I create the file. So I'm going to open that file. Okay. So you'll see now it's giving me those records. And this you can now import, this file you can import into EndNote or Zotero, and then you can do your screening of all the records. I think that is all for from my side. Are there any more questions? Okay. So the one question is, can I not just narrow down my search terms if I get 2,000 records being retrieved per search term? It's very dependent. You can't narrow your search terms. It depends what your topic is, whether it's relevant. So you would start refining. So you start with the two most important would be your participants and your intervention. If there's a comparison, then you would include your comparison. That is one way of defining your search. But generally speaking, you would just start at your participants with your intervention. As I mentioned previously, you wouldn't necessarily include your outcomes because we have found that most times outcomes are not clearly described in the abstracts. When you're searching PubMed, no, because PubMed automatically translates the titles of the non-English abstracts. I don't know, but what I would normally do is I download my records from PubMed and then I import it into EndNote. If there's no further questions, okay, another question. So the question is, how about topics that do not have clear PCOs, e.g. studies looking at prevalence of certain diseases?
So I think the PCO format can be used to formulate questions for any study design. It's not only for an intervention type of study. Even if you have a prevalence question, you can still identify what your population is, but instead of an intervention, perhaps you're looking at an exposure. So the E becomes the I becomes the E for exposure. You can still use people for other types of study design. What's important is to have that clear. Otherwise, it's very difficult to develop a search strategy and to conduct your review, actually. Is there a particular strategy for searching grade literature, searching new records from a reference?
No, there is no strategy for searching for grey literature. A start would be, I think, looking at conferences. That's number one. And you would go to the various, maybe the website of those conferences. Secondly, you would look at clinical trial registries for ongoing trials. So those are the two important places that you would be looking at when looking at grey literature. I don't have a list, but I think that's one of the ways to do it is normally to go and search for specific articles, and you can find where they've actually searched on your topic, and that will help you to determine where to search. Yeah, so if, like Solange says, with Cochrane reviews, it would be the relevant review group that will be able to assist you, because ultimately they then do the searches, run searches for those conducting Cochrane reviews. I can't say. I think it's very dependent on everybody, whoever's using, because I might like EndNote. I've heard people say that Zotero is good. With Zotero, you're able to import website links directly, which EndNote doesn't do. So I think it's a very personal choice. I think that's yeah.
That's an iterative process when you're testing a search strategy. If you see that somebody, a particular patient is moved from the record, go back and
yeah, because that ultimately will affect the results of your systematic review.
Lots of people are asking about the presentation and whether it's going to be available. So as I said in the beginning, the recording of this webinar is going to be available on Cochrane South Africa's website. In addition, we will email all the participants the link when it's up on the website.
And just to say, if you have any further questions, you are welcome to email me. My email address is joy.oliver@mrc.ac.za.
So there is a question on whether you can use only text words, or do you have to use mesh?
Yes, it's very important that you use both mesh and text words, because you'll find that sometimes what happens is, if I only used searching for mesh terms, if that article has not been indexed yet, and you'll find articles within PubMed, for instance, that hasn't been indexed yet, it will there is quite a good chance that it's not going to pick up the articles that it needs to. So that's very important that you search both text words and mesh. And what also happens is sometimes when you're searching for text words, it also then will link to the mesh. It will go to the mesh and find that mesh for you. So it's important that you use both, because that ensures that you're not going to be missing any of the studies.
If you didn't get Joy's email, you will get it when we send a copy of the presentation.
Well, I hope that you all found this presentation useful. If there are any further questions, you're welcome to email me. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.